Welcome to Democracy Differently, the podcast about why democracy isn't working and how to fix it. I'm your host Keith Hyams, and today I'm here with Mike Saward, who's Professor of Political Theory at the University of Warwick. Mike, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Good to be with you, Keith. Thank you.
So, as always, first question we have, in one sentence, what do you see as the biggest single problem with democracy right now?
One sentence. I'm going to say something which doesn't come up often enough in the kind of worlds that I work in, which is leadership. What is democratic leadership? Democratic theorists tend not to talk about it much. We worry about parties and populism and communication and disinformation. I think there's not enough talk about leadership and perhaps in particular what it means to see opponents as opponents and not enemies. You said one sentence. That was a very long one.
That was
so
a
I'll
long
stop
one.
there.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we'll go back to leadership in a minute. But let me ask you, first of all, about democratic design, which is what your recent work has been focused on. So tell us, what does democratic design mean and why do we need it? What's wrong with our existing democracies and why would we need to design them?
Our democracies have always been designed. They may not be conscious designs. They may be historically slow developing and evolving designs. But design suggests something which has evolved, has a certain structure for a certain reason, and is changeable, and is reformable, is not the final version. So democracy, in a sense, is always a beta version, always and ever a beta version. It is always, in John Donne's words, unfinished business.
Okay.
So the bringing design together with democracy is really my effort to try and capture that sense of unfinishedness, I think.
Can you give us an example? What's wrong with existing democracies? Why should we think they're unfinished?
They are probably too centralized. Rule by the people tends to mean the people receive rather than suggest or give and initiate. They are probably too centralized. That varies greatly. Switzerland is at one end of a scale and other countries at another. So there's three kind of huge notions about how the systems that we too often think, when we talk about democracy, we think, yes, certain countries in the world are democracies, certain ones are not, and there are famous indexes out there that people use and how many democratic countries there are in the world and so on. And I think that way of thinking of democracy as a pretty much given set of institutions, imperfect maybe, but a given set of institutions, blinds us a little at some crucial moments to how changeable it is, maybe how contingent that particular form of liberal electoral democracy may be, however valuable it is, and it's extremely valuable. So a sense of the contingency, the evolvedness, the changeability, the redesignability is the core thing I think I was trying to get at in general terms with the phrase democratic design.
Okay. But if we're thinking about designing something like democracy, that makes it sound like a very elite, a technocratic project. Is that how you want to see it? Is that the way we should think about democratic design?
No, it could be that. And if we look at specific examples of democratic design work, imaginable ones and existing ones, the phrase democratic design can be, you can put the emphasis on either word. If it's democratic design, the emphasis is on the nature of the work and the methods and the assumptions and the information and so on that goes into thinking about democracy structures and practices. How would you design or redesign them? You might think of the British House of Lords, for example, and how you might want to change the bring in an electoral basis to that, different mode of appointments and so on. So that would be democratic design. Democratic design lays the emphasis on the democracy. Who does the designing? Right. The emphasis there falls much more on who does the designing.
So who is that?
So, there are lots of democratic design experiments where researchers and design practitioners get out onto the streets amongst ordinary people, conduct things like, this is in some ways the conservative version of it, citizens' assemblies and citizens' juries. These are relatively newly designed entities which are designed, set up to elicit, in the words of one of these practitioners, what the people would think if they had the opportunity and were in the right circumstances to be informed and able to express their opinions safely. So that's just one relatively, as I say, conventional example. If we look at the work, I recommend to listeners the work of Carl DeSalvo, who's a key design thinker and very influential around democracy and design issues. And DeSalvo, who does most of his work in Atlanta in Georgia in the US, gets down onto the streets and follows and talks to community actors of different kinds, not even activists, just actors, ordinary citizens, and elicits views about what they think of their neighborhoods, their city, what is lacking, what needs to change. So that's a much more democratic emphasis on the democratic in democratic design in that kind of work. So there's a wide variety of work there. All of this in response to the phrase democratic design, which really can be emphasized. Either end of that can be emphasized.
Yeah. So, but if they're thinking about redesigning their communities, can you say a bit more about where the democracy, so there's democracy in that process, or are they also designing the processes by which their communities work? Is that the sense in which they're redesigning democracy itself? Could that also happen at the national level, or could we ask people to redesign how national politics works?
The democratic element, if I think I mentioned the work of DeSalvo, Isio Manzini is another one that some listeners might like to look up or know of. The democracy is in the practice for them. It's a little bit like a view of democracy as only really happening. Democracy is only really present when a group of normally ordinary people come together, interact, discuss, think about present and future and how they would like to shape it. Now, admittedly, that's a very bottom-up, informal, some might say, conception of what makes for democratic practice. And there is a tension between, coming to your point, there is a tension between that and what we often normally think of as democracy, which is not informal, it's formal, constitutional, electoral, party, parliamentary, and related systems of governance. So one thing that reminds us of is the capaciousness of this word democracy. Is it a practice or is it a thing? Is it a set of institutions or a way of thinking and talking and deliberating? Maybe it is all of those things together, and maybe clever institutional designs can capture both sides, as it were, of that. One final thing I'd say on that is that I don't think I'm in this position with my work on democratic design, but some of the authors that I've mentioned, the practitioners I've mentioned, are skeptical of what they sometimes call institutioning.
Yeah.
They are very fond of the informal, bottom-up, in some ways more spontaneous practices, equaling democracy. Democracy is in those practices and those processes, and wary of institutioning. In other words, those practices becoming somehow institutionalized. I wouldn't go that far myself. I think as Democrats, we need to embrace the value of institutions generally, and in good democratic institutions more specifically. So like any interesting, rich field of work and thinking, we have these extremes, and they're not really extremes, no. I would say we have a wide spectrum of ways of thinking about democracy and its futures, really at a quite basic level.
Okay, so we could think of democracy either as the process of having those conversations and contesting different views, or we could think of institutions, and we're trying to bring those closer together, and that's what design is about. One thing you mentioned in your work is this idea of an off-the-shelf model of democracy.
Yes.
And you're quite critical of that.
Yes.
Can you tell us what these are and why you're critical? What's the alternative to that?
In some ways, the key thing I was trying to do in the book is to say, okay, let's be really wary of this idea of there being models of democracy. So there are textbooks out there, and this is a common way of thinking of democracy, where there is liberal democracy, participatory, in more recent years, deliberative democracy, electoral democracy, and these models, or so-called models, are often treated as quite distinct from each other. There are overlaps and tensions between them institutionally and as ideas.
Can you give us some examples of each, just sort of make them real? What would
the one we're most familiar with is kind of liberal electoral democracy, where, and this is a familiar idea, we live with this idea every day, that free and fair, more or less free and fair elections with a majority rule, depending on the electoral system, to a parliamentary representative body equals democracy.
Yeah.
So you could call that an electoral democracy model, maybe a liberal democracy model, because it's normally a model that has constitutional or other protections for individual rights and freedoms. That would be the liberal bit.
Right.
So that's a very familiar one. In recent years, I just mentioned in passing the notion of a deliberative model of democracy. Mm-hmm. So I'd say 30 years or maybe even more now, this has been emerging. And the idea there is that you need to have more popular participation for it to be democratic, so that the liberal electoral model is too remote from the concerns and practices of ordinary citizens. But you need to do this in a structured way, because what people really need to be well informed, what citizens really need to be well informed, is the capacity to deliberate together in a relatively structured way, informed by strong evidence that comes out of research and experience. Experts are involved but don't drive the process.
So this would be like the
citizens' juries, citizens' assembly, deliberative opinion polls in the version by James Fishkin, a very prominent writer and practitioner in that area. So the deliberative model of democracy, in quote marks if you like, has been the emergent model, a very influential one in academic work and well beyond academic work, because citizens' assemblies in particular have almost been mainstreamed. You think of the Irish Republic experience in recent years around the question of abortion and other issues, that was very prominent, where a citizens' assembly was established by the Parliament, the National Parliament of the Irish Republic, to make recommendations, which would then go to a national referendum. And this is what happened. So that's a kind of institutionalizing and mainstreaming of that model. And in some ways, that example expresses my concern with the models paradigm, because the real impact, the possibility of deliberative democracy becoming really functional and effective in a living political system, depended, in that case and in some others, on its being allied with, sponsored by, supported by existing relatively conventional parliamentary, presidential and other structures. So in some ways, to think about democratic design is to step back from the models and think, what hybrids, what mixed structures, what mixed connections might you have between more participatory, more deliberative and more conventional electoral and parliamentary institutions? What new mix of structures and processes could be built from them? So in a way, my criticism of the models paradigm, if I can slightly grandly call it that, is to say it's not flexible enough. We need to do something more challenging, actually, to step back to what I call sometimes second order thinking, get away from these first order models, get back to second order thinking, and think more in a mix and match, potential hybrid institutional way of thinking about what I said at the beginning is always a beta version, always unfinished, our ideas of democracy.
So if I could make an analogy, is what you're saying, there's no use getting lots of different Lego sets, one for a spaceship, one for a dinosaur, one for a motorbike, because you've got so many creative models that you might make better if you just had loads of Lego bricks and you could build something that really worked for what you wanted to design.
We might want a dino bike.
Exactly.
That might be the thing that works best, and we've not tried it before.
Yeah, great. Okay, I like that idea. Let's talk about reinventing democracy and risks associated with that. Some people are going to worry that, well, okay, democracy isn't perfect, but it's stable at least. If we start trying to reinvent everything, and particularly if we're doing it in this kind of rip everything up and rebuild it brick by brick way, things could get a lot worse. There's a lot of risks there. What do you say to that?
Important not to reinvent everything. I would never suggest that free and fair elections should not be absolutely a central institution of any system that dares to call itself, claims to call itself democratic. But innovation does produce backlashes. And some innovations are seen as very large and significant, and for some people worrying and maybe threatening very ideas of democracy. Others might look at the same innovations and think, oh, that's relatively pragmatic, a relatively small adjustment. The country I'm from, originally Australia, has a really good example of this recently. In late 2023, there was a proposal to recognise for the first time properly, Indigenous Australians in the national constitution of the country, and more specifically at the same time to establish a body to be called the First Nations Voice, or Indigenous Voice. So this would be a body advising Parliament and executive government consisting of elected Indigenous Australian members. So this proposal for the voice and the recognition went to the referendum in October 2023, and it was defeated, 60-40. So it was a decisive referendum defeat. Why did that happen? Well, it happened for a few reasons, but one of the key ones, and this was very much present in the debate around the voice leading up to the referendum, was that to give Indigenous Australians this body, which they had asked for by another democratic process, but to establish this body would in effect, so the argument went, give Aboriginal Australians an extra vote. It would be inegalitarian.
Yeah.
It would give too much of it. Now, that is a view that I strongly disagree with, and I won't go into the specific arguments about that Australian case. So, to your question more directly, here was a democratic innovation, and genuinely so. It was not like the Maori people in New Zealand who have guaranteed seats in the parliament, for example. It was not like Norwegian in particular, but also Swedish and Finnish indigenous parliaments. That these are different in the realm of indigenous rights and democratization and voice. Mm-hmm. Those are other forms of innovation that are well established in all of those cases. So the Australian version of the Australian Indigenous voice was quite different. So very innovative, and it really does illustrate the point about how, from my perspective, I would say, thinking about that case and maybe one or two other similar ones, where we can get too stuck in very particular interpretations of what democracy must be. So in that case, for example, we might interpret democratic equality being a basic principle of democracy, we might interpret that as meaning only equal votes of equal value. Now that's a very important principle. But if you're dealing with to use the jargon, a settler colonial society, with the very dark history that Indigenous Australians today and historically have gone through, to say the least, maybe more substantive conceptions of equality, equalizing of circumstances in order to equalize the effect of votes, or something like that, needs to be seriously considered. I would argue, although it was imperfect, the voice model in Australia captured some of that sense of a need for what some political theorists, as you know, call complex equality, as opposed to a simple version of equality.
Let me talk to you a little bit about the process of democratic design, the framework within which that happens. It's not just that we throw all the Lego bricks in the air and hope they'll come together. There is a framework for this, and you talk in your work about there being 4 elements to that. Can you talk us through those 4 elements and how they work together to give us a framework for designing democracy?
Yes, so there are these 4 elements. I mean, most of my book called Democratic Design talks about these elements. So anything I say now is going to be very brief. But the elements are really about, one, the value of democracy, and therefore the value of a democratic minimum. Not just anything goes here. Democracy does mean something. It can't mean just anything. So there needs to be a democratic minimum, and I do set out in terms of freedom, resources, equality.
So that minimum is about minimum values.
Minimum is you can't get away with calling a proposal or a system democratic unless it reasonably matches these criteria. Now, of course, that's a matter of interpretation, but nevertheless. Yeah. So there is that element. The second of the 4 elements is really about what I call the dual core. There are principles and there are practices. Practices, in my language, would include a parliament's functioning, for example, so institutional practices as well. What principles are enacted or captured through a well-functioning parliament? Well, equality of representation, so there's 2 principles named there. A kind of virtual participation by ordinary citizens through representations, and maybe participation as well. In most parliaments in the world, parliamentarians can express their views safely and freely, so there is a a freedom of speech. In other words, there are certain values we can identify. It depends a bit on context and the particular institution. So that second point, the dual was principles and practices. In some ways, politics consists of practices which enact principles, and that's what I'm getting at there. And the third element I talk about is kind of sequences and all. If we're going to think about, okay, how does our democratic system function? What comes first? Who gets to speak first? Who gets to speak second? Who gets to endorse decisions that are made? Where does an indigenous voice or a parliamentary body, or in a federal system, a state government, what's the sequence of decision making, to put it in an overly simple way? And the fourth element is really, I would say, there is in the book a series of numbered points which adds up to what I call a democratic design framework.
And that's how we.
And I try to make this it's a work of political theory, yes, but I try to bring it to an institutional and practical level. What's the context? What's the time? What do we think the problem is? Mm-hmm. One thing design thinkers often say is you think you've got problem X, but as soon as you start to look at it,
you've got a different
your proposed solution becomes the new problem. So problem and solution are shifting. So we need a framework to work with, really. And in terms of these 4 points, the whole book is an effort to kind of lift the lid on each of those principles, practices, changeability, sequences of institutional practice, all of this.
What are some of these practices? So what are the ingredients that we're putting into the mix? We've talked a bit about elections and citizens' assemblies, referenda.
Yes.
Are there more? What are these?
Those are some of the classic ones. So we were just talking about some different forms of distinctive, indigenous, and you might broaden that out in some ways to say structured minority participation. You've got a range of deliberative bodies. You might think of participative think tanks, things that don't really exist at the moment, I don't think, as such, but why not? We might think of changes to existing institutions. For example, why doesn't the British Parliament move around the country for its deliberations? Why isn't it a revolving Parliament? Why doesn't it move? Why isn't it in Leeds next week rather than in Westminster? Why can't a representative quarter of the House be functioning in Edinburgh one week and Leeds the next, and then in Bradford? Why are we geographically and thematically and in terms of numbers fixed in the way we think that design must function?
So it's about the
So it's not just new institutions, it could be radically reforming older ones. What I deliberately do not do in my work on democratic design, very careful not to do, is to suggest what the best form of democracy would look like. I do that deliberately because to do that would be actually to negate the philosophy which is behind the notion of democratic design, which is to say democracy is a more open-ended ideal than we commonly think. Here is a framework within which to think about its fixedness and its open-endedness and its potential and possibilities. Please take my framework, crush it, change it, use a revised version of it. It's a tool like any other tool.
And who are you giving it to? Is this, we talked about communities again. Is this something that politicians can use, think tanks can use?
Yes.
Who uses it?
I've started a couple of things that I've done directly. So I'm involved with people who are leading up the main design policy unit across the UK civil service. I've done a blog on their blog spot, and we've had conferences and workshops with some of the key people involved there. They would say that policy design, as opposed maybe to polity design, but policy design, there's a close relationship there, is their main concern. You yourself, Keith, were involved in a workshop a few months back as we sit here at the University of Warwick, where we had design practitioners and others who would say they are more design theorists or design thinkers, with comparative politics experts and political theorists, people from science and technology studies, in fact, who are interested in the materiality of design in the kind of tradition of Bruno Latour, and some of the policy design experts were there in the room. So my answer to your question is probably overly practical, but there are connections that need to be made. And I have to say, not just my work, but there are others as well, but there has been very little dialogue between the design community, practitioner or more theoretically oriented,
so not just the democratic design,
and the political science community. That is a conversation that is really just beginning, and I think it's very exciting and very interesting, and hopefully will have some practical import as well.
Yeah. So the practical import, I think there's a lot more interest in democracy at the moment because people can see the many ways it's failing. Does democratic design offer answers to that? So let's start with populism, for example. Can democratic design help us with the problem of populism that we're seeing?
It's a big question, and often, boringly, I always say it depends on the context and the populism and what kind of populism you get in country X as opposed to Y is so steeped in the history and language and culture of that place. But taking that on board, one allegedly of the main democratic downsides of some populist politics is a kind of ventriloquism. In other words, there's certain leaders who claim to have special insight into what the real people, the good people, the patriots really think and really want. And I use this piece of jargon, ventriloquism, because often the people are silenced by that claim to speak for them. And it's just the leader speaking.
Yeah.
Making the allegation or the claim or the pretension that they have this special insight into, well, it could be what the people really think and want, or it could be what is really, really good for these people. So a claim to represent is also has a habit of silencing, oddly enough, silencing those you claim to represent. So in terms of democratic innovation addressing populism, actually engaging with ordinary people in structured contexts on a local scale, or maybe through something like citizens' assemblies on larger scales, actually bringing lived experience of real people into a context where there is a genuine engagement and potential import or actual import, we talked about the Irish example, into policy making at a local or national level. If populism, this is putting it too simply, but if populism pretends to talk to the people and know what's good for them, a democratic answer to that might be, let's actually talk to people.
Get them in a room.
And see, in a room and in all sorts of other contexts, in natural environments, and see. But we are in a period of populism. Maybe some of this comes back to leadership. That is another angle, and maybe that's that bit of self-criticism. Maybe there's a slight blind spot there too, because in my work on democratic design, I don't talk enough, I think, about what a concept of democratic leadership could be, should be. So that's work I want to go on and do.
Yeah, but, so you told us right at the start, leadership was the biggest problem with democracy. You say a bit more about that.
Why do political scientists pay so little attention to leadership? Now, some do, and there'll be protest that I say that. Certainly in my field, political theory, there is not nearly enough. Is it because we don't want to go down the route of doing psychological studies of political leadership, which is a relatively common, maybe slightly old-fashioned kind of strand of leadership studies? Business schools don't shy away from questions of leadership, corporate leadership, innovative leadership, even design. Design is very, in a slightly different sense, is very common in business schools. It kind of gets left alone as a little too hard, a little too psychological, a little unscientific, maybe, and yet. So in terms of democratic design, what constraints and opportunities for political leaders are created? Are there perverse opportunities through, for example, the relatively unregulated sphere of misinformation and disinformation, which some social media and other outlets seem to be mixed up in? I'm not sure what the answer is, but I suspect there is a piece of work ready to be done which does an update of Machiavelli's The Prince, which looks at what leadership can be, should be. I would like there to be more work on what it means to both respect and to oppose people in different political parties or in different political traditions. Some of that would be about performance in the theatrical sense. How do we demand that our politicians appear and perform and be exciting and charismatic and so on. Think how often that kind of thing becomes a criticism of supposedly dull, robotic politicians as opposed to supposedly charismatic ones. So maybe there's more interdisciplinary work around what kind of performances are authentic to us, what one should appear more authentic to us if we thought about it a little more. All of which is to say there are different directions, I think, which are all interesting here, but I would like to see, in my own work and in the work of others, more attention to the idea of democratic leadership.
I mean, this leadership really does seem at the centre of what's going wrong with democracy.
Absolutely, and thinking about leadership, worrying about democratic... First of all, democratic leadership is not a contradiction in terms, absolutely not. And worrying about leadership in and for democracy is very much not an elitist theory of democracy. You're never going to get rid of organisers, facilitators, leaders, innovators, initiators. None of that is incompatible with core democratic ideals in any way.
Yeah.
More attention needed. Yeah.
So we talked about the challenge of populism. What about the challenge posed by technology, particularly AI, the flood of false information and fakes that are out there, and another source of technological challenge to democracy, climate change. So we've had guests on the podcast talking about how democracy just isn't set up for making long-term decisions in its current form. Is this something democratic design can help us with, keeping up with technological change?
Absolutely. If we think of deliberative bodies or ombudsperson type bodies, there are other proposed institutions which you will have discussed on the podcast before, thinking about institutions for future generations, to coin a phrase. I think I've just named the title of a book.
That is a book, yes.
On this subject. So absolutely, and I would like to think, I hope, if it's useful, people should use it, change it, break it, as I said earlier, that the kind of democratic design framework, relatively practical, I think, for thinking about institutions for future generations, and for non-human nature, by the way, kind of representation. I don't think it's too strong a word to use for non-human nature. So hopefully, yes. My quick answer is yes, absolutely. Democratic design should be embracing future interests, if I can put it that bluntly, as well as present-day ones.
Great. One thing you do say is democracy is very contextual, so it has to be suited to a particular time and place. What implication does that have for democracy in the long run? Does this mean we're going to need to keep reinventing it as technology and society evolves so that it meets the new contexts in the future? Mm-hmm. Does this work against the stability of democracy?
It could be a core periphery kind of issue. At the core of any self-respecting, defensible democratic system will be a process of free and fair election and established institutions through which representation and participation function. Many of those do and will continue to look like each other from country to country, locality to locality. If that's the core, then this is too blunt, but nevertheless a kind of periphery of, okay, I used the Australian example earlier. A settler colonial society is very different from a non-settler colonial society in its history, its need to speak truth to its history, questions of what justice can mean and who questions of justice should apply to and recognition should apply to, questions of citizenship, effective citizenship. So there we get things like indigenous parliaments and other processes which wouldn't make much sense in Britain, for example, today, but which arguably, and I would argue, need to form a really distinctive, and I call them peripheral, actually in some countries, according to context, core parts of what in that place, given that history, democracy really should confront and consist of, or it's difficult to have a substantial conversation about democracy in New Zealand or Australia, for example, without seriously, much more seriously than has been done in the past, taking into account the history of the country and the extraordinary and multiple impacts that has had on the indigenous populations.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, we always move on to a quickfire round of questions.
Yes, quick.
So, in one sentence or less. First of all, have we outgrown current models of democracy?
No, but if we let them ossify, the answer might change.
What stands out to you from all the proposals you've seen for democratic innovations as the most interesting?
I'm going to go to a periphery, Rojava in northern Syria, building on the work of an old green activist, Murray Bookchin. Go and have a look. That is really interesting. That is horizontal and structured and organised and functioning. Very interesting democratic experiment.
If there's one thing viewers should take away from your work, what would it be?
Democracy is unfinished business, and it is so for quite specific reasons, which I attempt. Others can judge if I succeed, which I attempt to set out.
If you could have a partner in co-designing democracy, one person from the past, the present, who would it be?
Somebody to argue with about democracy, maybe co-design. So I'd like an argument with Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who is full of fascinating and rich contradictions between the democratic and the non-democratic, participatory and utterly non-participatory, and crucial issue, which I think is coming back on to certainly academic agendas and others, centralization and decentralization. Can you only have real democracy, whatever that means, in a city or a town? Thinking of Rousseau and Geneva, so I would like to have those arguments with the apparently irascible Jean-Jacques Rousseau.
And what do you think is the most misunderstood thing about democratic innovation?
The most misunderstood thing?
Yeah, the most misunderstood.
Well, the trickiest question comes at the end, isn't it? The most misunderstood thing is a plug-and-play model where you take, in recent years, I would say, the main proponent here has been, or the main possibility here has been a citizens' assembly. You can just plug that in and you've played the card of democratic innovation and design.
Okay.
It's not that simple.
We asked you at the beginning if there was one thing you could, one thing that was wrong with democracy, what would it be? So let's flip that. If there's one thing that democracy could do differently, what would it be?
Could do differently? I would like to see, because when you say democracy, I often think of democracies around the world. Context matters. In spite of my occasionally critical comments in the last few minutes about the deliberative model, I would like to see more systematic use at election time of deliberative polls and of citizens juries, citizens assemblies more at a local level, replicated widely across the local level, to have debates about policies, parties and candidates. I think that has a lot further to go.
Thank you very much, and thank you for joining the show, Mike.
Thank you, Keith. I've enjoyed it.
Pleasure. I've been your host, Keith. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please don't forget to subscribe and tune into our social media channels. Thanks for tuning in.